is about what is called intellectual decolonization. Since the late 70s, we've had different trends and different perspectives organizing a questioning of dominant hegemonic positions. The first was post-colonialism, and then in the 90s, mid-90s, there was a critique of post-colonialism from the Latin American Studies Association in North America, which talked about decoloniality, and Escobar has called it the decoloniality modernity approach. Both of these positions can fit into what is called a peripheral gaze, simply because they are questioning the hegemonic dominant position at the epistemic level. Both these positions also suggest that they have drawn from anti-colonial theory. And both these positions on which I have written, and I've critically looked at them, are very interestingly located within North America and have spread across to Europe and now across the world, and has become, in some ways to think of dismembering and displacing dominant hegemonic positions within social sciences. I would like to suggest that beyond and under these two positions is something I call anti-colonial social theory. And that is a theoretical position which has emerged within Asian and African countries. And this position emerged in the 1940s and continues in new ways to shape and question and query social sciences today. And I believe that we have to retrieve this position to be able to really understand what is the peripheral gaze. And this position, I would suggest, is very different from the one that emerges in North America and then gets spread over across the world, which is post-colonialism and decoloniality modernity thesis. So my first proposition for discussion is that for a need to retrieve and for a need to map what is anti-colonial social theory. And so I want to ask, why am I calling it anti-colonial social theory? It's a perspective that has emerged with and which is aligned to anti-colonial nationalist social thought. And this perspective has emerged in anti-colonial nationalist social thought as movements emerged within various colonized countries in the world, mainly in Asia and Africa. And since then, it has engaged with the ones that emerged in Latin America. And therefore, there's an entire larger canvas that anti-colonial social thought and social theory places itself in, which is within its engagement with, from and with positions in Global South. So I'm suggesting that there is today an organized understanding of what is a dominant and hegemonic social sciences. And this dominant and hegemonic social sciences has a long history of interrogation. And this long history of interrogation emerges in mid and late 19th century in colonized countries. And it has put together ways of thinking such that it is not only epistemic, but it is also presenting an alternate sociological theory of modernity. When I say it is epistemic, what do I mean? I'm suggesting that let me backtrack and say what I mean, because the title is about Indian sociology. I want to backtrack and talk about what I mean by sociology. The dominant hegemonic position that emerges in the late 19th century in Europe and North America and spreads across the world, which emerges in these 5 countries, England, France, Germany, Italy, and USA, and is associated with university structures, and it later spreads to rest of the world. It's a vast enterprise of knowledge production with various different national traditions. And these distinct approaches have more or less have more or less kept to the idea that sociology is outside economics, it's outside political studies, it's outside cultural studies, it's outside other forms of other fields and disciplines, and that and it has always affirmed a way of thinking which is linear, which means that it has a before and after perspective. What was before, pre-modern, and what was modern was after. It also was something that a field of knowledge that proposed that the pre-modern was located outside Europe and North America, and later North America, and that it has to be studied by sociology's kin field, which is anthropology. And these kin subjects were carved out and juxtaposed from other disciplines. These 3 to 4 critical assumptions of dominant hegemonic understanding of sociology has been questioned, as I'm suggesting, in anti-colonial social theory. And it does not, and this anti-colonial social theory, which emerges in a large number of today's post-colonial societies and countries, but which happened earlier in mid to late 19th century, had advanced a project to suggest that we have to rethink the ontological and the epistemological that structures theories of social sciences, and therefore presents a way of thinking which is that sociology is not something that is necessarily organizing before and after understanding. It is a global social science, and that ontologically it affirms a colonial capitalist position, and that to understand it, we need methods, tools, and ways of thinking that will extract and represent this colonially capitalist world, which has been organized since the 1500 and the 1600 in the world. So the periphery, in the way I'm thinking, represents ways to query colonialism and imperialism and develop a critique of colonial and imperial capitalism. And it is there in the content of anti-colonial social theory. That is my proposition. Having said that, I want to just qualify, because many of you know that anti-colonialism has a long history. As you know, the Oxford English Dictionary places the origin of the word in 1791 in context with the American War of Independence. And it is in the American War of Independence that the word anti-colonialism comes up. And it is then reformulated within the context of late 19th and early 20th century, when there is a competition among European colonial countries, colonial and imperial countries, to take over the territories of what it could not do in the Americas, and therefore they shift towards the other parts of the world. So anti-colonial social thought and social theory emerges in this context all across Asia and Africa. And it tries to suggest that what needs to be studied is what happened since then, since the time from mid-18th century or even earlier, colonial capitalism got established. And it is about trying to understand the history from that point onwards. Consequently, it is not about before and after, nor is it about the location of this understanding as something outside economics and politics and cultural studies, etc. So it's interdisciplinary in nature. And it is a critical perspective which constantly re-examines itself as it moves forward. And therefore, it also tries to understand what it could not do and what it could do since it got established as anti-colonial social thought and anti-colonial social theory. Therefore, I'm suggesting that the historical perspective of its beginnings, and I use the word beginnings with great, so I'm not talking of before, but I'm talking of beginnings. And this is the word Said had used sometimes to understand how to think of post-colonialism. The beginnings of anti-colonial social thought and anti-colonial social theory lies in the location of what we know today of Global South. It is not about being the other, but it is about being the I, and is about ontologically looking at colonial capitalism, and suggests that what we are talking about and what we have to assess and what we have to examine is colonial capitalism and its manifestations within different regions, bordered as nation states, not bordered as nation states, and to rethink how to do social sciences in this context. So that's the first part of my presentation, and which I would thus like to end by suggesting that what we have is what has been evolved consequently is an anti-colonial social theory which has three attributes. It assesses critically the relationship between colonialism, its societies, and academic scholarship. It advances perspectives capable of dethroning its hegemonic influence in social sciences, and it articulates new ways to understand the colonial imperial world. So it is therefore, to put it in a short formula, questioning Eurocentrism from its location. Eurocentrism as linearity and the juxtaposition of the binaries, spatial binaries, in terms of its location. And I have argued that social sciences in India have emerged in that context. And it has emerged as a consequence of the growth of anti-colonial social thought. So the peripheral stance that I'm suggesting is a peripheral stance which is both more in economic processes of the global world system and the associated intellectual flows and circulation and minimal exchange that has taken place from the core and the semi-peripheries and the peripheries. And a way to displace these ways of thinking to create new ways of organizing alternate perspectives, which is not only epistemological. You will recall that Margaret Archer has once said that most of the criticisms in 1970s to the dominant hegemonic positions have come from an epistemological intervention. What I'm suggesting is that this peripheral gaze has been something that has actually posited an ontological location of how to understand what social sciences need to do for continuing formulating knowledge, which is not dominant and hegemonic. That's the first part of my presentation. I have suggested in my work that from the time anti-colonialism emerges as an idea, a concept, and a way of thinking, and as I said, its definition has come from Oxford. I mean, Oxford, in English at least, Oxford Dictionary says it is 1791. It has moved through 4 phases. The first one was in the United States, which I just mentioned, when they questioned the royal positions on the territory of the United States. The second one happened in Europe during the late 19th and early 20th century when various parts of the Ottoman Empire was taken over. And the third happened in what is the global South, Africa and Asia, where there was, I would argue, a break, an epistemic break in understanding what was anti-colonialism. This epistemic break was related to a scientific investigation of what indeed is colonialism at a global level. And it occurred within anti-colonial social thought, even before social theory could be conceptualized. It occurred when in mid and late 19th century, various organic intellectuals, whether in Philippines or whether in India, used Eurocentric methodologies to subvert Eurocentrism. And how did they do it? And one great example is the drain theory, which emerged in 1867. And this drain theory actually showed how poverty in India is increasing by questioning the systematic transfer of India's wealth to Britain without any economic return. The wealth drain, and therefore drain theory, occurred through methods of remittance of profits that the British companies transferred. It was about high taxation of land. It was export of raw material cheaply and import of highly priced finished goods. It was about heavy administrative costs, use of taxes and revenues to fund wars in India as well as in other countries to effectively control more territories for Britain, and the extraction of resources, natural and material, which depleted India's economy and prevented its development. And I have suggested that the first steps taken to frame a peripheral case comes out of the drain theory. Since then, various intellectuals and various scholars and various economists have suggested that we are talking of 43.5 trillion pounds to be repatriated if we talk about the 200 from 1867 to 1935 resources which were drained out of India. It's a huge amount, and as they say, they'll never can, even for 100 years of GDP of England can never be repatriated. So the drain theory is still a live issue in the context of India. And it's also a live issue, I think, in various parts of the world, which has been drained out of its wealth. And this is the first steps in the making of the peripheral position. But the peripheral position is something much more than just this. It's not only about the economic. It is about the sociological, the cultural, the political. And the question is, when and how did the peripheral gaze emerge as an interdisciplinary critical theory? And I'm now going to talk of the vicissitudes that occurred when few steps forward were taken and many steps backward were taken to create this kind of a peripheral gaze and a critical theory of the peripheral gaze. And the reason for this is the way in which Eurocentric positions got articulated and institutionalized within India. So one of my assumptions, one of my propositions is that it's when we look historically as to how Eurocentrism has got represented and institutionalized in various countries in various phases, will we be able to understand the vicissitudes of alternate positions coming from the periphery. And as you know, there is a 200-year history of colonization. And the first point of formal colonization took place in 1867 when the Battle of Plassey was won by the British in Bengal. And since then, till 1947, so almost 200 years, the British framed ways in which they could extract wealth and other resources from the region that they were now ruling. And they ruled this region little by little, unevenly, and there were direct control and indirect control. But whatever it was about trying to present ways in which facts can be manufactured such that extraction of wealth and resources could take place. These facts were divided into private and public. And the public facts we know. It is demand, supply, etc. And these public facts are facts which were then scientifically organized through concepts. Ricardo was very important. Adam Smith was very important. And these became ways in which science was organized. And therefore, economics as a discipline was organized. And without having academic institutionalization, we had informal social sciences emerging. And these informal social sciences were very closely related to the governance of the country through the British India Company and later through the Crown. Consequently, the drain theory, which emerges, as I mentioned earlier, actually uses the same methods to subvert the imperial colonial proposition and suggest that if you have the same methods, then what happens when the nation state becomes the site for economic theorizing. And if that happens, then what would happen to the wealth? And if it gets returned, if the wealth is used for the sake of the people, then it is possible that you have development, you have possibility of transformation and transition to a new society. So this is the start of a scientific understanding of social science from the periphery. And this this way of thinking is extremely important because then it leads to an actual social theorization, which we find that took place in the post-colonial India through planning and development, and of course was influenced by Russia and socialist ways of thinking. And it was also very interestingly related to the fact that when the drain theory emerged, the attempt was to give a space to the business and the capitalist class, which was emerging under colonial umbrella. But when it got reformulated in terms of the larger nation of the country with its many peoples, and therefore it meant that it got reformulated due to the new peasant movements and the working class movements that had emerged from the early 20th century. So then development in planning and social science, economics particularly, once it got institutionalized in academia, and please just remember that we had only 4 universities till 1930s. So we are talking of post-colonial development in education that takes place only after independence. So what got institutionalized was anti-colonial scientific thought. And it led to a way of thinking about how to rethink the nation and nation state, and how to build a critical theory consequently, and what kind of methods you need to do it. And what was it? As I said, it was all about colonialism and the extraction of wealth and services, wealth and resources. So what do you do to need to reframe it, to rethink it? And it was really policy social science. What happened to the other social sciences? And that's where I think the weakness of the peripheral gaze needs to be brought out. So what we find across the world, whether it's in Africa or Asia, that by 1950s and 60s, as anti-colonial nationalist movements emerge, there's a critique of the colonial economy and the politics that have political system that has supported colonial economy. And it remains restricted. The peripheral gaze remains restricted to the economic aspects. What happened to the other, the sociological, the cultural, the historical? And here I want to go back to what I said the British tried to do. They divided the private from the public. And what was the private? The private was the sociological, kinship, family, community, caste. They divided the private from the public. And the private was thought in terms of Orientalist positions. Orientalist positions would be to look at And these Oriental positions had a very long history from 1400, 1500 onwards, when the Portuguese and the British and the French started traveling to India for trade relations and took many things back and forth. And it was also related to the way they understood themselves and perspectives they had developed about what constitutes society. So the private domain was a religious domain. And therefore, it was Hindu scriptures that gave an idea of what was society about. And these Hindu scriptures were written in Sanskrit. And therefore, what the Hindu scriptures mentioned as ways in which the society was organized became the site for understanding India. So India, with its large canvas, and today it has 1.34 billion people, with this large canvas, the Anthropological Survey of India would say that there are more than 5,000 groups and communities separated with each other. So with this large canvas of diversities, were all put and standardized together and homogenized in terms of what the Hindu scriptures understood it as being what the private domain was. So it was through the lens of religion, and that to Hinduism, that an idea emerged of what constituted in India. And in that idea, a very important part was played by the Portuguese term castas, which was caste. And it emphasized the fact that this was a different kind of a world, and this world was hierarchically organized in terms of graded hierarchies, which never met each other and was always fixed. This kind of perception was inherited by nationalism also. As anti-colonial nationalism tried to understand not only the public domain, which they criticized in terms of the economics, they also tried to understand what was the sociological knowledge, facts, which was organized by the British, and how to subvert that. And in the context of subverting that, they emphasized the fact that India was a culturally unique civilization. And this culturally unique civilization, which again was something which the Orientalists had presented, had its own system and which needs to be accepted and legitimized to understand how transformation can take place. So while the public domain used modern categories and modern methodologies and modern science to subvert colonialism, the private domain, which sociologists and anthropologists were working on, were actually legitimized in a new way Orientalist positions. And they legitimized by doing it as Indology. So in the early 20th century, formally India gets its first sociology department in 1919, just at the same time Munich gets. So it has a long history of having sociology, but for India, sociology meant really anthropology, because as I said, it was not considered a modern society. Sociology studies modern society, while anthropology studies pre-modern, traditional, pre-literate, primitive societies. And therefore, though it had a sociology department, what was studied was this Indological and Orientalist reconstitution of ways of understanding the Indian sociological, when India had already got colonized, and therefore economic colonial relations were already established. So there was this juxtaposition of anti-colonial nationalism, which is, as I said, a peripheral gaze, actually reconstituting colonial modernity and institutionalizing it. So that is the weakness of a peripheral gaze that I want to point out when I pointed out the strength of the peripheral gaze earlier. And this is not only true for India, it was true for many Asian and African countries, where an exotic cultural is essential. Positions that were received in and from colonialism was reconstituted in the context of confronting it. This is its paradox, and the paradox of the peripheral gaze in most of the ex-colonial countries. However, does it continue like this? And this is what is my last part of the presentation. I'm suggesting that by 1970s, a critique emerges of this form of reconstituted colonial categories through a critique of nationalism. So this is a new intervention that emerges, which reframes what is anti-colonial social theory, because it suggests that nationalism is the site on which colonialism gets reformulated. And if you critique nationalism, you critique colonialism. And it's interesting that this happens in alliance with the growth of Marxist interventions, which talk about the new post-colonial state as a class state, planning and development as an intervention to support the bourgeoisie in India, and ensuring that there is very little possibility of those who are at the bottom level to be able to have access to the so-called development that the state is promoting through planning in alliance with the Soviet state at that time, because they had institutionalized the Soviet state's model of planning and development. And in that context, and this is not only true for India. I can give you examples from Africa and various other places where this continues. And so what is interesting is the innovative Marxism that emerges in the context. It's not European critiques of Marxism. It's not Marxism as been critiqued by European Marxists, but it is an anti-colonial Marxism, which locates itself within the empirical of the current colonial capitalism. And that is the most important part of it, because it then formulates new concepts. For instance, it has formulated the concept of unorganized informal sector, which constitutes a class which is not in exploitative relationship with those who own the means of production. When you have a working class of 85% to 87% who is not in an exploitative relationship with those who own the means of production, what do you call them? These kind of questions about concepts, about theories, etc., started emerging. And it got formulated and reformulated in the context of three specific social movements that emerged in the late 70s. One was the women's movement, where women and work literally brought out how work within the household and outside the household is invisibilized. And how do we understand it? So we had interdisciplinary projects emerging in understanding a particular group, which is women. The second is the Dalit movement, Now, Dalits are a new word which has come with Dr. Ambedkar, which is the oppressed. It's the lowest caste, the ex-untouchables. And the Dalit movement emerges again in the late 70s. And it uses narrative to understand what is stigma, what is humiliation. So new concepts emerge consequently to that. And the third is the tribal or the Adivasi movements, both in the heartland of India as well as in the Northeast. And both these movements try to understand what does it mean to be peripheralized. So you have a gamut of concepts, theories, propositions, axioms put together by these kind of three interventions. And we have interdisciplinary studies emerging of women's studies and Dalit studies and tribal or Adivasi studies and Northeast studies. And they all present ways in which interdisciplinarity can help to build a new social science. And this continues with the project which I suggested emerges in the mid-19th century, 150 years back, and presents again today, I mean, in the 70s and 80s. And this happens only with the criticism of the limited and elite notion of nationalism. So in the criticism of nationalism, it's criticizing coloniality of knowledge. And this is its most important contribution, because nationalism is about criticizing coloniality of knowledge. At the same time, it also emphasizes radical nationalism as a way to intervene. So it's a very interesting paradoxical situation in which the peripheral gaze gets critiques as well as reconstitutes itself, in which nation and nationalism remain important, but in different ways and meanings and ways of thinking. Today, we are at crossroads regarding the peripheral gaze. And I think this is true for a large number of countries in the world. We are at the crossroads because of the following: neoliberal interventions in the reformulation of universities and research institutions, privatization that has happened, and with the student as a consumer. Consequently, it's about what should get taught, why it should get taught, and what is the value, economic value of what is being taught. And that economic value defines what should be taught. And consequently, critical thought and critical theory has very little space. There's a deficit of it, at least in mainstream institutions. But with these mainstream institutions and with privatization, there has been withdrawal of funding to public institutions. So we now find that there are very small number of teachers, very small number of students, very small number of interventions being made. And a large part of the university structure are in private hands, which is interested in medical and business and ICT education rather than social sciences. So that's the first. The second, of course, is the growth of the rightist populist movement in the country, and since 2014 has promoted a way to disband ways of collecting data, understanding labor participation rates, understanding work and workers, ways to changes that were made in the census to understand women's work within household. All these very important interventions that were made from the 50s to the 90s are now at short shrift. And so facts, different facts, subverted facts are not being collected. Secondly, the kind of theories and perspectives that emerge with reconstituted Marxist intervention in feminist studies, in Dalit and tribal studies and Northeast studies has not been able to progress further. And consequently, we are at crossroads. So I've just given you a history of, let me say, 100 years of formal academia and 150 years of informal academia that emerged in India, and the vicissitudes, the strengths it had, the weaknesses it indicated, and yet its presence is still there. However, with the world becoming more corporatized, the dominant hegemonic positions now control more and more the publishing industry, as well as what to write, how to write, what to teach, what not to teach, what forms of pedagogy to have. And in this context, and what curriculum and syllabi to institutionalize. In this context, it leads me to ask a question, whether we are seeing reconstitution of the colonial agenda once again. And I ask this question because at this moment, the rightist populist politics is reinventing Orientalism in different ways. And the critique against inequalities, against exclusions, and against injustices, which had defined from the 70s onwards the social sciences, have been retreating in this context, and with the weaknesses of institutions in the context of neoliberalism. So I end by saying, I'm not sure where we are going now. I've suggested we are at crossroads at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I will just stop recording.